Okay, here we are at kind of low magnification. We want to see what a relined impression looks like. This one was poured, so you'll see the stone stuck around the sides there. This is exactly the way I pulled this impression off of the model. You can see that it was originally taken with blue and purple. There were some defects, so they relined this with the yellow material, which is imprint 3 from 3M. Very low viscosity, flows in there very nicely. You'll see it filled the defects. You can also see when I tilt this that it also flowed very nicely into the sulcus all the way around the tooth, which when we see the model here in a moment, it gives you just a beautiful, beautiful result. So we'll increase the magnification here a little bit. This is where I do most of my work. And you can see actually very easily the diamond marks from the prep. So this is a very beautiful impression. You can see where the reline material completely disappeared out of the side over here, so there's no change in the actual body of the impression. In areas like this right here, if I can find it, there we go, this area right here, you can see the yellow material is completely gone into a tiny little layer, if at all. So you know that it didn't affect the size or shape of that final impression by much, if any. So it makes for a very nice result. You can only do that if you don't overfill the impression with the reline material, because otherwise you have too much hydrostatic pressure. There's just no way you can reseat that impression excuse me, without distorting it, or without not getting it completely seated. How's that for a double negative? So if you have too much material, there's just no way you can get that reseated. And you can see that it only flowed out a little bit to the ends there, mesial and distal. It's around the buccal and the lingua there. But that's a pretty nice result. So we'll look and see what the model itself looks like. And it's kind of overblown here, but when we increase the magnification, just like with eyeballs, you need a lot more light. And you can see how the sulcus was very nicely captured in these areas. What that means to me as a CAD-CAM designer with my scanning means that I can very quickly and easily trim this model up. It might be difficult to scan some of these areas just because the scanner sometimes doesn't quite capture these narrow little spaces. Excuse me, these little narrow spaces between the tooth and the gum. So what I do typically to make it easier for the scanner, as I'll show you here, is to actually reduce the height of the gums. And this makes it very much the way a regular lab model die model would be trimmed, with the one advantage of I don't have to pin it and do all the other stuff that the regular labs do. So you can see how now I've exposed that margin. I won't go all the way around for you here, but you see now I can see that straight from the side. You can see how nice the shoulder prep is on this as well. And now I can scan that margin from any angle. I start from the top, and I also do it from the side, and I can also do it from way down here at a really low angle to better show the exact shape of this little tiny edge of the margin. Right along there, shoot that from the side, look at it in profile, you can see how those are shaped. So that's pretty much what we're looking for with an impression. And on our final models, you can see I have a tiny little bubble here. If I wanted, I could fill that with, if it were a little bit bigger, I might be tempted to fill that with some occlusal pit sealant material, just because it flows very nicely and I get a nice thin layer. But when that mills, it'll just mill right past that area. It won't really affect the fit there. So all in all, this is going to be a nice quick one to trim up. You see it'll take me a few seconds to do that side. I'll do the same thing around the rest of the way around the tooth, just so that it can scan beautifully. Might not have to do this side, but I'll do it anyway, just because it's going to be so easy. Because all I have to do is come in straight from the side, and and all those gums just go right away, just like this. And I don't even have to be extremely careful, because it's just going to chip away all the way down below that margin. And I started using these 12B blades just because it gives me a lot of precision with both the size, because the tip you see is quite small, but also because it's so sharp, it makes it very easy to carve the stone. I was using just a sharpened Explorer, but they wore out really fast, and they tended to spring back and cause me some trouble that way. Really nice when you're this really sharp edge is nice when you're trying to define a margin that's equigingival and is basically just a change in the shape of the curve is really all you can see in some of these equigingival preps. And I'll photograph one of those for you a little bit later. Alrighty, so we're back with this same model here, our first one. And you can see I trimmed up the gingiva all the way around, so we have a nice exposure of the prep all the way around. Looks pretty sweet. Another nice thing about this view is you can see from the stone, you still get to see those diamond marks in the stone, even though I'm not using dye stone and a vacuum mixer. Like to use a whip mix sometime. I think that'd be fun. Do use Wonder Add Mix to help keep the bubbles to a minimum. Helps a lot. That's part of the reason why that stone is so nice and shiny. You can see that right there. But you can see the diamond marks on there, which makes it easier to distinguish between the prep tooth, which you see up here. You can see the diamond marks in that, and the unprepped tooth down here, and the gingiva. And that's really handy to sometimes that's all you have to work with to tell the difference between prep tooth, particularly on an equigingival shoulder margin. If a nice shoulder margin like this, if it's equigingival with the gums, sometimes the only thing you have to distinguish between tooth and gums is the texture. So you'd just be looking at the diamond marks versus smooth or stippling on nice healthy gums. Find the pause button. And another thing I wanted to show you on this particular impression was the way we use our opposing impression, which is sometimes called a bite registration. I try to discourage people from using that term because it doesn't really express the way we actually use it. So in this particular case, the assistant forgot to take the opposing impression, which we like to have just a little single tooth impression like that. Forgot to take that impression until after they had already cemented in the temp, which was good that they remembered, but then they took the little bite, and unfortunately it's kind of distorted. So I can't quite tell where it's supposed to fit, where it's supposed to be vertically. So it's kind of useful, but kind of not. You see, if I seat the back portion of it back here, then the rest doesn't work. And if I seat this part into the anatomy of the tooth, it's way out over there. So it's kind of distorted. It may or may not be helpful to us at all. So what we'll have to do is pour up the opposing portion of the impression and then hand articulate it together. So it kind of goes maybe sort of like that, but maybe like that. So yeah, that one's going to be a little tricky. So a little extra work involved. And here's another case. On this one they took an impression, and you can see the opposing impression is quite substantial. It goes all the way across. And then when you seat it on the, oh, that's the wrong side. That's actually the opposing dentition in stone, and you'll see why I poured that up in a moment. Similar situation to the last one. Nice little prep there. Some shoulders on this side, shoulders down in the floor there at the distal. So this is a nice little shoulder all the way around. You can see with our impression when we put it on there. Problem is we're missing that buccal cusp over here, and I kind of like my buccal cusp to be part of my impression, so it's kind of missing there. And I think we can get away with that. When I first glanced at this without under magnification, I thought that I would need to pour up my opposing, but we can just start to see a little bit of where that cusp curves up here. So get that back in focus. It just kind of curves up there, so we can get away without that. But there will be this little line that, and this little wedge right there. It's going to complicate matters a little bit when we trim up the opposing. And I'll show you how that looks on the computer later in the scan software. So we don't have to pour this one up. I went ahead and poured it up, and actually if we articulate it on there, which we have a hard time doing because it's poured up on the stone, you can see how the cusp just starts to show. There's just a little tiny indent on that distal cusp. So now we see, okay, yeah, that's where that ends. So turns out we didn't quite need that opposing impression, but it's easier to do it all at once and not have to come back to it at the last minute when you're trying to do your design. So let's go on to a different one. This is a little bit more of an ideal situation. It seems to be the attack of the molars here today. So in this one, again, we have a nice prep, and my shoulders all the way around. This one is straight. I'll just show you this in up close. This one is straight out of the impression. Never even touched this one. You see it's all super gingival. Nice shoulders all the way around. Should be plenty of occlusal reduction, plenty of axial reduction. With the exception of that tiny little bubble, that's a very nearly perfect model from a very good impression. Never even had to touch that one. That saves me all the time for trimming that and double checking it. Saves all the worry of being uncertain where the margins are. So super gingival is nice. We just have to be careful when we do our staining, particularly if it's on the buccal where people will see in the smile zone. Depending on where this person smiles, they probably aren't smiling back to that molar, but it might be. But we kind of watch out for staining. You don't want to have a line along the gum line, just because you stained it to look like natural tooth, but their root's a different color. So you can put in some funny little odd lines that have to be polished off or redone. But this is a little bit more of an ideal opposing impression. See, this one just pops on there quite nicely. Goes about a half a tooth over either way. And you can see from the thickness of that they were pretty much a maximum intercuspation all the way around. Just a very thin layer of that bite material there, very thin layer here. It's almost invisible right there. It's definitely see-through. So this is like nearly perfect. So when this is articulated onto the model, you can see that I haven't increased my occlusal space by any more than that thickness right there. So this is really close to absolutely nearly perfect. So when I do my design, if I design that opposing anatomy to be right there in relation to the prep, that will be just about perfect. It can only be off by about the thickness of that, which, as we know, is significant in the mouth, but that's the maximum amount of error. As opposed to if we had to use a triple tray impression, and I don't have my dial caliper handy, but maybe on the next video I'll show the thickness of that. On the triple tray, you're always going to have at least 100 to even 200 microns thickness just from the thickness of the webbing material inside the triple tray. That's why a lot of traditional crown and bridge specialists, as we'd like to call them, we'll actually do full arch impressions and articulate them for every single little crown. Now, the way we use these little single tooth impressions, which they'll sometimes call a bite, but I really like to call them an opposing impression. The way we use that is the first thing we'll do is we'll scan in either our tooth in the mouth, or in this case we'll be scanning a model, but scan your prep, and then you'll have the adjacent teeth as far as it needs to go. It might be a full arch, but you'll scan at least those adjacent teeth and your prep. And then you will actually go back in, at least on the E4D, go back in and you'll rescan those same adjacent teeth, the same model, with that opposing impression in place. And what I do to make that scan just a little bit more nicely is I'll trim off some of these extras. And we don't really need this part here, so I'll trim that off. Don't really need those little extra bits. And this was a very nearly perfect one. I liked it as an example because there's just so little to do with it, and it's just the tooth that I need, just the anatomy that I need. It has all of the it's not perfect down through here, but it's really close. It's got the cusps, and it's got some central grooves in there. I've seen some that are a little bit better, but this one's all in all is pretty darn good. So. But the important part is how it fits on the model. So we'll rescan the adjacent teeth and the preps with that single tooth opposing on there, and it'll look exactly like that. And then what the software does is it subtracts out those adjacent teeth and just leaves the opposing anatomy and our prep. And then the crown, of course, fits between the prep and the opposing anatomy. Fits into that space. And so that's really all the crown has to do, is fill the space between the prep, the opposing anatomy, and the adjacent anatomy, and then look and act kind of like a tooth. So we want it to have nice anatomical form. That's really all it does. It fills in that space, and then we make it anatomical. And that's the way those are used. So we're actually using the same model, fitting that opposing onto that, as opposed to using an impression to actually articulate two models together. And this is a case where we have two teeth side by side, so I actually articulated this one from the triple tray. But when I scan this, still I'm going to scan those teeth and get back here to the distal of that and the medial teeth up here. I'll scan those teeth and I'll come back and rescan it with the opposing impression on there, and my crowns will again fill the space in between. And the reason I articulate these is just so I can recheck the bite afterward, just to make sure that everything's really nice. So I have to do minimal adjustments in the mouth that way. It's always my goal to not have to touch them with a burr. So what you would do with a traditional case is you would place your bite registration between, articulate those models together, and you'd be forming those in wax and shaping them and make them all nice and pretty, and then you'd have to pour those up into investment material and the lost wax technique for whatever it is you're going to do, whether it's a pressed ceramic or cast metal or just copings, and then you have to do all the ceramist work on top of that, which is really a skill in and unto itself. Neat to see. So we look at this one, we see immediately, this one's going to be a little trickier. Not quite as clean as some of the other models that we've seen. Looks like there's a drag over here on the buckle aspect of that. Little bicuspid there. So I'm assuming that's a drag at this point. I'll look at it under higher magnification. We can see if the diamond marks are visible on that. Probably not. and looks like puffy gums here on the adjacent tooth, and it's subgingival and equigingival. Some drags and bubbles and stuff, so this one's going to take us some extra time. And another nice thing about this one, the reason this one's articulated, is because we're also doing the opposing arch, a molar on the opposing. So the good part is the teeth aren't opposing one another, because that gets to be a little bit more complicated. So we have that tooth up there, and we got this tooth back here, and so you don't have to worry about fitting them to one another. That's always a little additional complication, but easily handled once you figure out which way to go. And usually I start by just fitting one of them in. I like to usually fit those central grooves, and that usually works pretty well. If I begin with that as my main plan. So here's some of the complications we get with subgingival and equigingival preps. Increase our lighting here a little bit, and higher magnification, and we can see not going to be quite as much fun as we hoped when we woke up this morning. So you see the some contamination here, probably not gum tissue pulled over there, but probably some moisture stayed in there. Over here where it's rough is probably some just insufficient rinsing of the tooth before they took the impression. So it's what that little bubbly roughness looks like. A lot of times you'll see it on the adjacent teeth as well. Gotta watch out for these little drags on the adjacent, because we're fitting our tooth in next to that, and that'll mess with our shape a little bit. Get confusing later on if you're not noticing that. And there was some, the impression didn't go all the way up here, so there was lots of places where we got bubbles. Good part is we don't have to worry about those, because we're just working with the prep that we're actually working on. Now that looks like a drag to me, so it's got no texture to it. Probably just complete air inside the impression where that drag was. So we'll trim that off. Notice there's diamond marks on this adjacent tooth. So one of the doctors may have tried to improve the line of draw a little bit. May have been previous Dr. Prep or this latest one. So that adjacent tooth is hung over too far. It makes it really tough to clean up the embrasures. So it's probably done on purpose. It's usually not done accidentally. Somehow the doctors are able to do that without hitting the adjacent teeth most of the time. So tricky spot. Here's a big old bubble. It's just pop right off most of the time. It's kind of weird how that works. And then the hard part here is going to be figuring out where the gums are in some of these other places. So we have to compare the texture on our prep to the texture of the gums. And also assume that most of the time it's going to be very natural curves to work with. So this little drag right here, so we can kind of trim that up. Sometimes if the fingers slip just a little bit, so they're refining that margin, they'll boop, they can pop in there and just lower that. But since this is a little higher here and a little higher there, it's probably again just a tiny little drag. It usually comes from just not rinsing and drying that tooth sufficiently. Or maybe they didn't get their impression material in there quickly enough after they rinsed and dried it. Go over here to this other area. And we're going to have to try to guess where the gums are, maybe if we're lucky. the impression material underneath that, and it'll chip away. Nice thing about working under high magnification is we can see all kinds of stuff that you don't get to see without it. Bad part is you got really limited range, focal distance there, so it's hard to see more than one tiny little spot at a time. So yeah, we'll say that's probably a moisture drag across there. We'll trim this really from two sides is what we do. Trim it from the other side. And maybe have a little better view. Where were we? We were on this side. This side where we maybe have a little better view heading that direction. So this is going to be a tricky one. So you can define a very tiny little edge with this 12B blade. And because it's quite stiff, as I mentioned before, I used to use an explorer just to kind of define those. I would just come in and just define a line, say that's where my margin's going to be. But the explorer would flex a lot when I did that, made it really tricky to get a nice smooth edge. So you just kind of follow. Can't really tell where that margin is. But if we go down here and look for impression material that came off inside the stone, and sometimes we can hunt them from the outside in. And that kind of connects up with this almost invisible little line right there. Curve over here. And since it would be very difficult to make a prep like this, I'm going to assume that that's a big old bubble in the impression. So not quite a drag, more like a bubble. Again, probably moisture trapped in there. This is an area where assistants can make it much easier for the doctor to have all the material ready to go, handy, so that the doctor can dry that tooth off and put the light body impression material on that prep immediately without any wasted motion or time. If they can get that in there in a couple of seconds after they rinse and dry, then they avoid a lot of those difficulties. So effective assisting makes it much easier, particularly in cases like this where you're doing upper and lower arch simultaneously instead of adjacent teeth. So I'm doing two opposing sections. So we'll try and trim that a little smoother. Fortunately, being a bicuspid, we can use maybe a little bulk out there. But if we try to fit our crown around a drag like that, then we end up with a huge, big, bulky gum line, and that doesn't work. It becomes a maintenance nightmare, an aesthetic nightmare, and maybe bother the patient's tongue. So we're going to have to use this same kind of technique most of the way around. Kind of sneak in from the outside. Trying to find some impression material in a tiny little focus. Just kind of hunt our way around here. So I won't film the whole thing because this one's going to take a long time and you'll die of boredom. But that's kind of how that technique sort of works. You're going to sneak your way in there. This is a case where if you can scan this in the mouth, it's much easier because when you're doing intraoral scans, gum tissue looks totally different from tooth. At least again on my E4D, it looks very different. It looks darker. So even though it's shooting with a laser, it has just a darker look. It's much easier to tell what's what. So you can just look in there and go, oh, okay, there's tooth, there's gum. Plus you can tell right away when the patient's still there, oh, you know what, I need to do better isolation, or maybe I need to do a little laser troughing or a little E-surge troughing just to expose that margin a little bit better. Maybe I'll try placing another cord or a little bit more hemidin or stringent or something like that. So we're going to do that all the way around this one until we think we've found the margin all the way around. And then we'll do the other teeth.